Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Heyman Marrero from Urbender, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of I Have Something to Say. I'm very excited to have as our special guest, María Cherjovsky. She is the president of Florida Abilities and Inclusion Network. And I want to start by congratulating you, Maria, for your award. She just recently won the Orlando Business Journal Diversity in Business Award for Lifetime Achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
But like I told you offline, it's like lifetime achievement. Like, what's up with that? You're so young. You still have a good 20, 30. Just take it there. So many more years in you, to do the work that you do in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, I was like, do I congratulate her or do I put on my gloves and fight with the Orlando Business Journal because they kind of like insulted her? No, I'm just kidding. But, it was like, that dichotomy, like, okay, but I think it's well deserved and well earned. So congratulations,
Thank
because
you.
you've been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for 26 years. And I feel like not a lot of people can say that. Now you're working with the Florida Abilities and Inclusion Network, but I would like to ask you, how were those early days of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Tell me, because it seems like people are like catching up right now, and you've been there, done that, and you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly throughout.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for the recognition. This may not show it, but yeah, I have spent 26 years in this space. But I also have to say that for those of us who started early in DNI, we didn't know what DNI was. We didn't have a name for it. It was a matter of advocacy and watching what was happening around us with our kids, our neighbors, our relatives, our friends, any social groups that you belong to, and really taking note of opportunities that we had and that they didn't, or how society may have treated them differently, and how it wasn't necessarily right. And so it takes someone to want to carry that torch and right or wrong to say, this is really not fair because that could have been me. That could be my child. It could be us in the future. And so, what am I able or willing to do about it? Because this is not something that is acceptable in my book. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I had to literally look back and to realize, and other people pointing it out, it's like, but everything you've done in this space has been DNI. And I'm like, really? Because there was no name. It was more about what we will call social justice, or someone who, like I said before, right or wrong, or advocate for someone. Those terms we have all used, but there was never an umbrella like DNI. So what were
Yeah.
those early years like? Very different, because maneuvering in a space that has no label, that there are no best practices, that there is no charted path to follow, and you have to figure things along the way and learn a lot from listening to people, talking to people who are disadvantaged, who are underserved, who are even marginalized, and realize, where have we gone wrong and where can we
Mm-hmm.
make a change. And in my early years, I was not in leadership positions, right? You wouldn't have expected me or anybody my age to do so. But I think that is the biggest misunderstanding, thinking that you have to be in a position of leadership to make a difference. And that's not true. You know,
Mm-hmm.
just like, for all of us with kids, I'm sure you tell your kids the same thing. If you see somebody bullying somebody else in the playground, you don't just look the other way, right?
Right.
And so, how is it different from advocacy and working towards inclusion in other aspects of our lives when we see these kinds of situations happen everywhere. So my journey was very different, and we can certainly talk about that if you want to know how it all
Yeah.
got started.
Yes,
But that's
absolutely.
really
Because
where it stems from. Watching
yeah,
what's happening, listening, and when you have that empathy within you, and you're like, gosh, that is just so wrong. I would
mhm,
never want for my kids, for the people that I love and that I care for, to ever be treated that way. And
yeah,
that's when you make a choice. You
yes,
stand up and you do something to make a difference, or you stay
yeah,
quiet. And I could
yes.
never stay quiet.
Yeah, no, I know you. I know that you would never, never stay quiet. Hence, hence the lifetime achievement award. So I'm fascinated by your. I mean, we would need hours to go over all of your experience, but let me just say that you've worked locally, citywide, statewide, nationwide, and internationally. And this has been your purpose in life, to really create spaces that are equitable and really focus also on the workplace. I know that in your last couple of roles, you've been completely focused on creating access, opportunities, knocking down barriers that prevent people from reaching their full potential and being seen as a participant and as a person of value in their workplaces. And so how did you get there? I know that DEI people automatically go to like the racial differences and diversity within the ethnicity or racial space, but it's much more than that. You've worked
It
across
is.
veterans and disabilities and so many LGBTQ plus community. I mean,
Yeah.
women. I mean, the full shebang, right? And I'm particularly interested in gathering your thoughts about diversity or challenges that are not seen, that are not that visible,
Right.
like in the case of some disabilities.
Right. So to sum up some of those experiences, because technically all 26 years I have been advocating for opportunities in the workforce, I just didn't know
Mhm.
it. Um,
Ah,
so when I moved to the US, I moved to the US in 1994. And I had worked as a marketing manager for an international beer company, the non drinker, mind you, working
uh-huh.
for a beer company. But I was also a high school teacher teaching computers. This is when I really get to date myself. I used to teach
Mm.
DOS, WordStar, and Harvard graphics because
Oh
Windows
my
did not
goodness.
exist. And so I moved to the US, and, I had limited options based on my visa status and everything else. And I came in within 3 days, moved, started college again. And I was working in the university, met someone who eventually became my husband.
Mhm.
And I watched him also struggle, like many other people that I met, with the right career path. Is the university the right option for me? And what I learned from some of those experiences is that everybody has a story, but
Mhm.
when we create systems and pathways that we can sort of label as a one size fits all, that's where we leave so many people out of that equation,
Mhm.
because not everybody's going to follow that typical model. That's why we
Mhm.
have names now for trio programs, or first generation college students, or
Mhm.
someone through a career transition, or
Mhm.
that's why there's AS degrees, which is a 2 year with a terminal
Mhm.
degree. All of those
Mhm.
things exist because of that, because most of us are non-traditional. Yes,
Right.
systemically as a society, we create systems that are traditional to cater to what we think is the majority, right? That's what
Right.
we all do,
Mhm.
because we can't accommodate what we should, but we can decide by design create things for everyone in every aspect of our
Mhm.
lives. So with that being said, working in academia, I worked in colleges that everybody was international. I had people from all over the world working with me, and there were some um, cultural differences, right? So
Mhm.
that in itself took some training and even some negotiation for them to
Mhm.
understand some things are not allowed in the US. You're borderline breaking the law in doing that. So
Right.
even that was D&I, and I didn't even know it.
Right.
Bringing together different cultures and ideas and approaches to human interaction, simply because we all came from different places, but we have to find some common ground and accept
Right.
each other's differences. And the journey was not easy. I mean, I was very young, as a young Hispanic female in a leadership role where everybody around me, just about everyone, was a male in their 50s and 60s.
Mm.
It was tough. No,
Yeah, I
most
bet.
people did not want to listen. There was from the US, I think that at that point in time, they were maybe a little bit more open minded because they're like, well, the rules are the rules. So, we can't deviate from that. We chose her for the role. She's good at what she does. Who cares? She may have an accent. She's not from here. She's young, but by golly, she knows what she's doing. And so they were able to balance things out and look at what I brought to the table. Then you had others with different cultures and different beliefs. So if you look at Middle Eastern individuals, they had a very different perception of me because we know that as a culture, they perceive women differently. And
Mhm.
so bringing some of those ideas into the workforce, that was a big no-no, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
some things were said and experiences that I went through that should have never happened. And I had to
Right.
learn how to advocate even for myself. But more
Mhm.
importantly, when I went to work at the community colleges, that's really what opened my eyes to, because I was by default, and because I was forced into it, I didn't know any better. I went through the traditional path. Hard,
Mm.
easy, didn't matter. But
Mm.
my husband changed careers a number of times, and then when I worked, I didn't know about community colleges. They don't
Mhm.
exist in most parts of the world. And
Mhm.
so when I went to work at Seminole State College, it was such a wonderful experience because I learned about 2 year degrees, terminal degrees for
Mm.
people who couldn't afford the time or the interest or had learning or cognitive disabilities that couldn't
Mhm.
afford to be there for 4 years or work towards something longer. And it's not even because I don't want to imply that they have any cognitive learning disabilities, but you find all of that. You find the at least back then, the non-traditional students who they were helping their mothers, who were single mothers, right? Who
Yeah.
had a part-time job. And I also got to work with clients from Voc Rehab in VA who had just come back from military service and had lost a limb. They had lost their
Mm.
sight, who took a grenade to their face,
Mm.
who took a bullet in their brain, and now they have memory loss. And so, how do
Mm.
you expect them to get through an education that will open doors when now they have other limitations potentially that interfere with our ability to follow that traditional path that we have laid
Yeah.
out for everyone, the
Mhm.
one size fits all. But then also, I met some wonderful people, and I learned a term I had never heard before, and that was displaced homemakers.
Mm.
It's a term that most people don't use anymore, but it
Mhm.
basically means women who have dedicated most of their lives to raising their children, taking care of the household,
Mhm.
being the CEO of the household while the
Yeah.
husbands work. And now they either facing a divorce or they lost their spouse, and they have to provide for their kids, provide for their families, and now they have to wear both hats, and they do it all on their own. And
Right.
so they didn't go to college because they chose a different path, the path of motherhood and being a housewife or stay at home mom, which there's nothing wrong with that. But their life circumstances have changed. And now they need something, some credentials, some education to be able to open doors in the workforce. Otherwise, they
Mhm.
wouldn't qualify. And
Mhm.
based on how society sizes people up, they, by
Mhm.
certain standards, they may even have been perceived as too old to start in the
Mm.
workforce. So,
Right.
how do you create opportunities for those people? And same
Right.
applied to migrant workers, people who had moved to the US from Colombia and from Venezuela and other places where they had a lot of economical and political issues. And I've
Mhm.
met, and this is probably another one of the biggest eye openers I had at Seminole State, which is why I said I spent there 2.5 years and I learned so
Mm.
much about
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the cafeteria because it was too much trouble leaving the campus and coming back to get a bite. And I would hear the cooks speaking in Spanish, and nobody would really give them the time of day. I want this, thank you, move on. And so I would just start a conversation because why not, right? They're doing their
Yeah.
jobs just like we were. Before I knew it, I found out that the two cooks that were there, one was an accountant and the other one an
Mhm.
engineer,
Mhm.
right? I'm again, I'm talking 20 some years ago, right? So
Right.
it wasn't always talked about. Now is we see that everywhere. But they
Yeah.
escaped their countries because they wanted to give the families a better opportunity in life. But the
Yeah.
credentials didn't transfer. The language skills
Yeah.
needed some improvement, and
Mhm.
they could not find a job in there. So what were they doing? Flipping burgers and serving meals at the cafeteria. Minimum
Mhm.
wage, but at least it was something.
Yeah.
It was decent work, and they were honored to do it. And so
Yeah.
again, how do you help those people who are moving to the U.S., those in career transition, adult high school students who dropped out, and now they're coming back for a GED, right, at
Mhm.
an older age. Girls who had to or chose to leave school because they were pregnant,
Mhm.
or those who were bullied.
Mhm.
How do you encourage them to pursue opportunities, and how do you create a path that may not be as challenging for them to maneuver and can yield the outcome that they're expecting and the same opportunities we want for all of our kids in the next generation?
Mhm.
So if
Yeah.
you start to think about it that way, just about everything that I've done, developing programs and services and education opportunities and advocacy and education, it all ties really within DNI.
Yeah.
And it only progressed from there. I went back to UCF, and I was leading all of the programs in continuing education. And I remember that because it's a revenue generate self-supported unit, basically,
Yeah.
had to generate the budget to pay for itself. It is not funded by state dollars, unlike what most people may think. We had to sell training and develop programs, all of which I was doing, to fund our division, a state division, that fell outside of college credit programs. So, of course, I run
Mm.
programs for NASA transition. I work with shared services when they shut down years ago, working with career source, working with those unemployed, getting grants,
Yeah.
emergency response, training opportunities, all of those things that tend to cater to unique demographics.
Mhm.
And again, another aha moment happened when I remember going to our vice provost and said, why don't we establish wraparound services? And I remember him looking at me and said, well, what do you mean? This is transactional. You're providing training. They sign up, they show up, and that's it.
And
And I
that's
said,
it. Yeah.
that's not true. The entire team is fielding phone calls, and that's where most of their time is going because everybody who we're catering to, most of them actually, 99% adults, there's fear and anxiety of going back to college. Some of them have
Right.
never gone to college. Some of them are switching careers because their fields are not able to support them anymore. So,
Yeah.
all of those things also pertain to that. This is not baggage, this is
Mhm.
a need.
Yeah.
And so, how do you again advocate, create programs and opportunities for people who find themselves in a unique situation in their life, and how do they go from there? So, again, I spent 18 years doing that, and
Mhm.
so I knew that continuing education and workforce development was really a great outlet to advance that because you could do it a lot faster than any other type of education in
Right.
education program. And as part of marketing and community relations, which I also handled, I was dealing with my own struggles with
Mm.
I don't necessarily feel like I belong here
Mm.
because among Hispanics, many would say, well, you're not Hispanic, you're too white, you have reddish
Mhm.
brown hair, you are fair
Mhm.
skin. You sound different. Well, from Central America. So just because there's
Mhm.
not a lot of people from South America didn't mean that I
Yeah.
didn't belong amongst Hispanics. And then when I
Yeah.
would go back home and visit, I didn't belong there either anymore because they had moved on as a culture, their dialect, their way of speaking, the music, not maybe not the true traditions, but things that my generation was doing. I was like, what is that? And they're like,
Yeah.
hey, you the old one out. You don't live here anymore. So yes, I
Right.
still have those friendships, but it didn't feel the same. It felt
Yeah.
like I was listening. So when you feel like you don't belong there and you don't belong here, this is why now in D&I we have added that sense of belonging at the end of that. I
Yeah.
also went through that. And so, in
Yes.
finding for a way to belong and advocate, I run into an organization called the Florida Diversity Council. And I signed up to work with them, and I started developing some of their education programs and coordinating that. Well, within 6 months, they asked me to take over and become the president.
Oh, wow.
of the organization in Central Florida. So I was doing that while I was working at UCF, and UCF was happy because again there was not a lot of D&I within the
Yeah.
university, and
Mhm.
allowed me to champion for education and those opportunities and the programs that we were developing with employers and other individuals in the area. So I spent 7 years leading that organization. It was supposed to
Mhm.
be a 2-year term, and I reported to the
And you
National
stayed,
University
yeah,
Council.
and you
And they were like,
stayed.
"Can you
That's
stay
great.
another 2 years? Can you stay another
Yeah.
2 years?" So they kept extending me. And at the end of 7 years, I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's too much. But again, I learned a lot about D&I, women,
Mhm.
minorities, LGBT. But I learned the flip side of that, right? I learned
Mhm.
the corporation uh, take on that. When you work
Mhm.
with Fortune 500 companies or even Fortune 100 companies, and you hear their stories, their struggles. Remember, up to that point, I was dealing with the individuals that were going to enter
Right.
the workforce. This balanced
Yeah.
things out for me because now I got to see the other side of that coin. What is
Right.
happening from the receiving end? The
Right.
employers who are looking to
Mm.
advance that, what are their challenges and struggles? So through the university, I was able to adjust what I was doing for the individuals re-entering the workforce and address all of their challenges, mental health, whatever may be happening, and their education and skill sets.
Mhm.
And then with the companies, I was able to help them become more inclusive in their policies and guidelines, bring about more understanding, so that we created that great marriage of the two. Because if either one of those sides of the equation failed, the whole model failed. So
Yeah.
with all that, real quick, I transitioned. I figured, I was helping about 6 to 7 thousand people a year, and I was like, there's
Mhm.
gotta be more. I know there's a lot more. We can't tap into all of that, and I had to connect it back to education because of who I work for. So I was like, is
Mhm.
there a better platform? Before I knew it, an opportunity came back with Goodwill Industries of Central Florida, and
Mhm.
going through the search process, it took about 5 months. I was
Yeah.
selected as the VP of Mission Services and Workforce Innovation. And that just fully opened it up. It was almost identical to what I was doing at the university. But I had a team of over 100 people, 29 locations, and the ability to serve over 50,000 people a year. And we were placing about
Mm.
12,000 people in jobs. And the ones that
That's
came to
great.
Goodwill even
Mhm.
were even more marginalized because now you're talking about drug addiction, mental health, the more severe cases of low rehab,
Mhm.
homelessness, and a lot of other challenges as well. So now we
Mhm.
really got into wraparound services to get them settled, to get them to get them in a
Plugged
position
in.
where they
Yeah.
could think
Yeah.
about education and employment, because at that point they
Mhm.
were thinking about survival mode. Where's my next meal
Right.
coming from? Do I have roof? Will my
Right.
kids be safe? When you have moms living on the
Yes.
street with their kids and they don't know where to go,
Mm.
the last thing they're thinking of is their future, college, work. They're in survival mode. And so we had to get
Yeah.
them to that stage that they were able to even think about that and then coach them through that process and create other services and programs to that effect. And last but not least, doing that for a couple of years, then the sad news came that the president of the Central Florida Disability Chamber passed away. And I reached out to a couple of the board members that I knew at the time, and giving my condolences, and I offered to help with anything they needed. I certainly believe in their mission. And they happened to mention they were doing a national search. They wanted to keep the organization afloat,
Mhm.
but they needed a new leader. And so they said, if you know of anyone or if you're interested, please throw your name in the hat. And
Mhm.
through my experience in Goodwill, I really learned how badly marginalized people with disabilities are, because disabilities are misunderstood. We think about someone in a
Yeah.
wheelchair, someone who's blind, someone with cerebral palsy who, has lifelong limitations. But as we were discussing before we got started, and in some other events that we've connected, um, there's so many more disabilities. It could be diabetes, it could be high blood pressure, it could be migraines. Anything that the definition is anything that impacts our ability to perform and go about our daily lives, right? So the entire gamut can potentially fall into that. But we as a
Yeah.
society have this image, and so I figured, well, I was looking for a bigger platform. I think the universe is telling me here's another opportunity
Yeah.
to
Yes.
advocate for another group that are still is still disadvantaged. And when I thought back
Yes.
about my 7 years leading the Florida Diversity Council, I remember that anything that was connected to disability were still off the table because it's still considered
Yeah.
taboo or potentially an insult, or people may not take it the right way, or we don't have all the answers, we don't have all the solutions. So let's just tackle something else. So I figured
Right.
if we always tackle something else, when is it going to be a good time to tackle it? And how many more people have
Yes.
to suffer because of it? So of course, everything I
Exactly.
take on, I dive in,
Head first. Yes, I
yeah,
know.
head
Yes.
first. And
Yes.
so I applied for the position. They did the national search. It took, like I said, about 4 or 5 months to complete. They selected me as the new president, and that's where that new journey began. So,
Mm-hmm.
I did my 30, 60, 90-day plan, presented it to the board. But within 30 days, I realized because I did a 360, met with people in the community, governmental officials, clients, partners, funders, board members, didn't skip anyone. And,
Mm-hmm.
same questions: what's working, what's not working, what you like, what you don't like, what do you think is needed, what about your membership, what do you hear? And so I took all that
Right.
data and I put it in themes, and there were four
Mm-hmm.
key things that came from that eventually informed how we were going to move forward with the establishment of the new organization. And those real quick were: one, there are a lot of organizations that look at DNI and they looked at this organization as a way to ensure compliance. And by that I
Mm.
mean
Right.
EEO, affirmative action, Community Reinvestment Act. And then the other
Right.
three things were: how and why are they connecting with us? What is that point of contact? What is the common denominator that drives them here versus causing someone to leave the organization and not work with us anymore? Why are we losing people? I mean, we tend to talk about those things when it comes to engagement and social media, but it applies regardless in business. What attracted
Yeah.
you and what caused you to leave? And not many
Yeah.
people take the time to learn
Mm-hmm.
that. And so we
Yeah.
did. They were coming to us, like I said, for compliance. They were coming to us for talent development, because when
Mm-hmm.
the economy is good, everybody's fighting for talent. And there's just not enough pipelines to supply people. I mean, I've heard recruiters tell me, find me someone who can stand up and breathe. You know,
Oh
it's
my
just like,
God.
I don't care. I just need to hire people. I have so many. Find me
Yeah.
someone. And that was not intended to people with disabilities. But when
Mm-hmm.
you looking to explore all options available to you, the chamber became one more pipeline. But for some people, that
Yeah.
is the only connection they saw with us, which I thought was more transactional and was missing the
Yeah.
bigger picture, which was inclusion. And then, of course,
Yes.
we had the lesser number of companies who were really looking to change the policies and practices, develop strategies and initiatives because they really wanted to become more inclusive, and that was coming from the top. And we love those stories, and we love working with all organizations. But if I have to, being truthful, that's my favorite group because to make those systemic and long-term changes and make them stick, you have to have a cultural transformation. It can't
Yes.
just be a policy that people may interpret differently. Or I think, I thought. No, no, no. It needs to become full. It needs to be buy-in throughout the organization, even if it's tied to bonuses, even if it's tied to
Mm-hmm.
performance reviews, and many times that is recommended. But it
Mm-hmm.
has to become embedded in everything the organization does, and all of those things eventually informed who we became, because we
Mm-hmm.
realized that the term chamber was more of a distraction. We were not
Yeah.
about business to business, let's do the networking and let's go have a drink and socialization. We were all about transformation. And so
Right.
that's why we changed the name, and we didn't change our mission. We honed on something more focused and specific that people will hopefully get behind.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that with the history that the organization already has in representing the full spectrum of people with disabilities, you have become like that go-to place to
Mhm.
really be able to understand best practices and also explore solutions. Now, this is a fluid space. When we're talking about terminology, approaches, even the people in their identities and their
Mhm.
challenges throughout the span of your career. You've seen all of these changes, and the different use you mentioned before about belonging, like that's the new coin phrase or whatever,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
For
well, it wasn't new for me
inclusivity.
because I lived it 20 some years ago.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that now, all of these terms come and go. And I find that I'm amused sometimes when I'm in certain spaces. And like, for example, with the Latino community, now it's Latinx. And some
Oh,
people
yeah.
have very strong opinions about that. And so they no, but I remember 25, 30 years ago when it's like, oh, oh, you're Hispanic? No, I'm Latina. And then you would tell a Latina, say, oh, you're Latina? And they're like, oh, I'm Hispanic, because that was back then, that was the issue. It was like,
Yeah.
which of the two terms do you prefer? Now, fast forward, almost 3 decades later, and it doesn't matter. They're pretty much interchangeable. But now they're throwing Latinx into the mix, and oh boy,
I
Lord
know.
have mercy. It's like, can just wait, language is fluid. You say tomato, I say tomato. At this point, let's just talk about the challenges, the systematic barriers that prevent people from living with dignity and having access, to a viable
Exactly.
future, and to, you know, be able to just perform at their fullest, and be able to live life to the fullest.
Yeah.
I mean, can we just forget about what you call it? Because in another let's talk about Latinx in another 10 years if it sticks.
It won't exist anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe it'll be accepted. It'll be just, who
Maybe.
knows. But yeah. But have you seen this in all of these years? I mean, is that the case? That terms come and go, some stick, some don't. I mean, and does it really matter?
I don't think they matter. I think that they tend to take away from the areas that we should really be focusing on. Like I try to teach my kids about pick your battles. It took me a long time when I was like, this is not right, it's not fair. And then you grow up and you realize
Yeah.
that is not an existential issue. I can live with and that's sort of how I talked to my young kids and I said, is that really going to change your life? Is that detrimental? Is that a hurdle? Is that going to impact you? Is that insulting you? Well, no, but it's not fair. So who cares?
Right.
You're going to
And
encounter so many things in your life that you don't like or they're
yeah.
not fair. But you can't go through your entire life fighting about everything and everyone, fighting everyone, because then that's the label that you will develop and how people will see it. Oh, this person argues about everything. And before you know it, your voice has less value when you're perceived
Mm-hmm.
that way.
Yeah.
And so you have to pick
Totally.
your battles, right? You have to
Yeah.
look at what is really worth um, championing and where do you want to carry that torch. And with kids, I certainly want a better world for them. And sometimes I wonder, they have my husband's last name first and mine second, and my husband has a fully Hispanic name. And I
Mhm.
wonder we've seen so many cases and studies done about when people submit resumes, how there's even bias based on what your name is and what people assume. Both of my kids were born and raised in the US. I am ashamed to say that they don't even speak Spanish because they were in
Mhm.
daycare at the time they were 4 months old. So my daughter's learning now through music, and she always had,
Mhm.
her ear perked up, and that's how she picked up a few things. She didn't want to be left out of the conversation. My son has no interest. He would much rather learn a different language. And so
Mhm.
we all make those kinds of decisions. But it's ironic that they look like me, fair skin, reddish brown hair. They both have blue eyes. But when you look at their names and last names, and if you didn't see them, you're like, oh, Hispanic. And I
Mm.
wonder, based on how much of what I have seen, when their time comes, will that become an opportunity or a disadvantage? And so
Right.
that's where I sometimes wonder, is it really worth fighting about Latinx,
And
Latina,
about
Hispanic? I
labels,
mean,
about
if you
yeah,
want to get technical into that, you can go into Latin America. It excludes
yeah,
Brazil because of the language. I
yeah,
mean, if you want to really get
yeah,
technical, that's where we will
yeah,
go.
yeah.
But does it really change what we're trying to do? And that's why I try to discourage people from going into rabbit holes that really take away from the true critical and valuable conversations that could really change the path that we are on. Other than that, I don't think that, as I said before, there were any terms before. When I joined the Florida Diversity Council, I didn't know much about it, like diversity. What does it mean? The definitions. What are the laws? What do they cover? And I think that between different groups that have come forward and said, hey, that doesn't include me, or I don't feel like I'm represented. That's where I think that the terms have started to change. And the other piece is that I want to say maybe in the 2000s, when people,
Mm.
organizations started to get behind disability. But let's not forget, a lot of the disability really stems from equal employment opportunity and affirmative action,
Yeah,
because if the law
yes,
didn't dictate what some of those requirements are, especially for organizations that depend on federal funding and others, where they have specific requirements they have to meet, or even supplier diversity, or working with aid organizations where they have to set aside a certain percentage
hmm,
of their funding for those entities. This is all governmental regulations that they have to comply with. So now, even though that's been on for a long time, we're just now shifting the conversation to diversity on the human factor, right?
yeah,
And that's where you see different groups. I think that with LGBT discussions and same-sex marriage um, being approved in so many different states, when that started to happen, and then it triggered, well, what about benefits? Can they not get
yeah,
benefits because? So
yeah,
it just started to snowball. And before you know it,
yeah.
well, we need a name. And even then, LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQA, or plus.
Yeah,
And so you keep adding because there's new groups, new segments of our community or society that start coming together, and they want that sense of belonging and be labeled somehow so that they can have that representation and support that they're seeking. Um,
yes,
but I think it's a matter of perspective, and more about, let's allow everybody in this planet an opportunity to have a dignified life, an opportunity to work, an opportunity to reach their full potential, to reach education, to provide for their families, and the freedom that they deserve. Because life is
yeah,
short enough as it is. Let's let
yeah,
everybody live to the fullest, and let's give everybody the same opportunity. So that's just my own perspective. I don't tend
yeah,
to get hung up on labels, but more
yeah.
about the human rights side of things.
Yes, absolutely. And in closing, just to learn a little bit and be more mindful of people with disabilities, what would you say are their primary challenges of people with disabilities in the work that you're currently doing, so that way we could put it out there and people could be more curious and also observant, mindful, and where they can also step in and become advocates also of people with disabilities in the workplace.
I think the biggest challenge is lack of understanding. I was
Mhm.
speaking with someone, um, name unknown, we'll leave it out, because we both know the individual and the organization. But I was surprised to hear that, well, aren't we doing enough with people with disabilities when, we provide handicap parking?
Mm. Hmm.
And I was speechless, which doesn't happen often. And I thought it was a joke, right? And this individual was, very candidly asking me different questions. And I said, well, because I happened to mention that mobility was one of the biggest challenges. And the response was, well, that's how we have handicap parking. Is that not enough?
Right.
And I said, no, it's not enough, because most individuals with disabilities, first of all, the challenge is defining what disability means. Now, equal employment opportunity has taken, EEO has defined some because of protections in the workforce. But when you
Right.
look at the true definition of a disability, it's very vague. It's any impediment that anybody may have, physical or mental, that prevents you from going through your life in ways that other people do. So if there's anything that hinders your abilities, and that is considered a disability. Now,
Oh, wow.
we cross this
Mm,
over to EEO when it comes to what are the responsibilities and expectations of employers and how
mm,
far do employers have to go to provide accommodations. That's where the law has stepped in to define, to contain somewhat what that means and what is an acceptable, reasonable accommodation, right? Whether it's
right.
schedule changes or providing an elevator or different lights if you have migraines or access to a window, whatever it may be, right? So there's different things,
Mhm,
but it starts with understanding what a disability is. Just about anything that
mhm,
none of us are perfect. And I remember opening at a conference, I want to say maybe 2014. And in part of my opening statements, I there were about 400 people from companies that I said, please raise your hand if anybody has taken medication today. Three-quarters of the room raised their hands. I was surprised they were
mhm.
going to. I figured they were like, I
Yeah,
wouldn't tell you. I didn't say what type of medication. Have you taken
right.
vitamins? Do you have vitamin D deficiency? Do you take hormones because you're going through menopause or you had a
Mhm,
hysterectomy? Do you take medicine because you have headaches? Do you take any medication for diabetes? Do you have high blood pressure? And I just threw out a lot of things, and I'm like, don't tell me what it is. If you're taking any pills today or any medication whatsoever, liquid, pill, injection, raise your hand. Three-quarters, if not a little more in the room, raise their hands. And I said, okay, would you be insulted if I told you you have some kind of disability? And they all just
mm,
looked at me and I said,
mm.
that's what it means to have a disability. It's an impediment. Thankfully, in most of our cases, there's something to help us cope and go through
Yeah.
our everyday lives,
Mhm,
which is why we don't acknowledge and recognize most of those as disabilities, which in a way is
mm,
good because we don't like those labels, but it's also
mhm,
a disservice to those who have a physical disability that is more obvious because we see them differently as a society.
mm.
But when we
Wow.
start to think about how we're all disabled in one way, shape, or another, and that was the topic of our
Mhm.
presentation at this last week,
Yes,
you tend to
uh-huh.
change the way you think about it because the
Yeah.
challenges those people have are endless. It starts with mobility issue. If anybody, did you know that for females, which happens the most, that have fibromyalgia, that's also a disability?
No, I
Arthritis is a
didn't.
disability.
Mhm.
Early onset of dementia or early onset of Alzheimer's, which now can start as early as 38, is also a
Yeah,
disability. So, what
yeah.
are we saying in terms of us who are working longer, who are living longer? If we don't tackle this topic of disabilities today, for those of us who are fortunate to live longer in our lives and be employed
Mhm.
longer, we will have more ailments to worry about. And if we don't do a
Yes.
due diligence now for our brothers or sisters, relatives, people that we love, and our society overall, we will be also carrying that burden when our
Experiencing,
time comes.
yes, and
When our time comes,
experiencing exactly, and experiencing the inequities and disparities in services and lack of
all
access
of that.
and increased barriers and all of
Right.
that. Wow.
And so I share a quick statistic with you. I don't have them in front of me, so my numbers may be a couple of percentage points off. But traditionally, employment for someone without an extreme disability is at least 66%. When you look at people with disabilities, only 19% are employed.
Mm,
And of those 19%, 32% of those, so that's
mhm.
roughly what, 6-7% of society,
Mhm. Yeah.
are employed part time. Why?
Wow.
Because people with disabilities may need more time to go to the doctor's office more frequently. So employers may not always accommodate them to take that much
Mm,
time off. They may
wow.
also increase potentially, right? They could
Mhm.
potentially increase with chronic conditions the cost of medical benefits provided by the
Yeah.
employer. Also, the fact that they may need transportation assistance. if somebody
Mm,
has narcolepsy, for example, you're not going to drive. They're not going to give you a driver's license. If you have
right.
visual impairment, depending on how severe it is, you may not be able to drive. So now you rely on a relative, a neighbor, a friend, or someone else to
Right.
drive you. A taxi is too costly. So in Central Florida, what is the most widely used means of transportation in those cases? Links. Links has a
Yeah.
program for people with disabilities and even elderly people that they will pick you up at home and take you to whatever you gotta go. But think about it for a second. It needs to be confirmed 3 days in advance.
I know. I
Do you
know that
know how you
happened
feel?
with,
Do you know how you will physically feel 3 days in advance? I don't.
yeah.
And on top of
Yeah.
that, but it's understandably so. And I was in a presentation and conversation with people from the Transportation Authority, and it makes
Hmm.
sense. And the comparison I can give you is remember whenever we travel to another city, unless you want to pay full
Yeah.
price for a taxi, and then the fear as a female, right, getting a taxi with a
Right.
stranger. So we may
Yeah.
get into one of those vans with multiple
Mm,
people that they make
yeah.
multiple stops to every hotel. How long does it take you to get to your hotel?
Oh, forever.
Forever, because they made multiple stops. So
Yeah.
Lynx is doing the right thing, but they need to have
Yeah.
a routing system for
Yeah.
efficiency's sake, which means that
Yes.
they have to know who's going where 3 days in advance to be able to route it and get everybody where they need to go at the time they need to be. So
Right.
take it back to people with disabilities. That just consumes your entire day because you're not going to
Yes,
go to a doctor's
totally.
office or an appointment. Oh, Maria came in. Come on, chop, chop, treat her. No, you wait in
Yeah.
line. You wait at the
Yeah.
doctor's office. So think of it from an
Yes.
employment perspective. If that happens frequently, that's another full day that they can't work. So
Right.
now you're compounding the issues with transportation. They have less means, financial means, because they may be working part time or not working at all. If you look at the
Right.
disability benefits, the average disability benefit from the Social Security Administration is $11,000 a year.
Wow.
So how they live and how they support themselves and how they mobilize, it's certainly playing against their ability to secure employment when employers are looking, they may want to do the right thing, because many do.
Right.
But by the
Yeah.
same token, how do you juggle trying to accommodate someone who has a more severe need? Yet you have to
Right.
perform, you have quotas, you have to manage your team, other people who you can't tell other people in your team this person has a disability unless it's a physical
Right.
one, someone in a
Right.
cane or in a wheelchair or something like that.
Yeah.
You can't speak of that. You have HIPAA laws
Right.
that prevent that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so you may have other people say, well, that's not fair. That why does that person get preferential treatment? So it's
Yeah.
very sticky for managers. And this is why
Yeah.
HR needs to be involved and how and why more training is needed to have
Yes.
policies, guidelines, and systems in place. Whereas you're not creating a toxic environment because people misunderstand situations, when in reality, employers may very well be trying to accommodate and advocate for people with disabilities, knowing that it requires more of the organization as well.
Yes, that this is really fantastic, and I'm glad that you were able to join us today, because I feel like these conversations aren't don't happen often,
Mhm.
and you learn a lot when you do have friends that either acquired a disability because of an accident or some life circumstances, or have a, from birth, which is also very, like, a whole other educational process, but I just feel like being respectfully curious is always the best policy,
It
and
is.
that a lot of training has to be done, like you mentioned, about situations, policies, best practices, and everything. But I think about empathy, feeling empathy, and really,
Right.
the human aspect of it too. That
That
it's not always
Yeah,
about the bottom line, and how actually these inclusive environments foster
they
productivity,
do.
because people feel good about employers that recognize and challenge you to be a better person and to
Absolutely.
really create this, foster inclusion
Yeah.
and embrace others. Mm-hmm.
Well, organizations that are inclusive are statistically 19 to 25% more productive, and
Mm-hmm.
slower is the revenue. It shows that it takes time to get there, but
Yeah.
the main reason for that is that we are savvy shoppers. We are
Yeah.
now exposed to so much through social media and whistleblowers and all of these things.
Yeah.
A lot is exposed in ways that it
Yeah.
wasn't before, and so we get to learn about leaders and how they run the organization and comments. I mean, look, what was it? Wells Fargo CEO recently that made a comment about how you can find professionals and tech savvy, I forgot the term,
Yeah.
amongst African Americans, right?
Yeah.
And so it was in every single media outlet you
A
can think of,
disaster. Yeah.
right? It
Mm-hmm.
was like a PR nightmare.
Nightmare.
And
Mm-hmm.
so what happens when those things come up? Unfortunately, and I'm hoping he didn't mean it that way. I'm sure he didn't. It's just a poor choice in words. Um, he may have said it's a struggle, or we have
Yeah.
to work harder to find them, or we sponsor the
Right.
education to help them get there. There's different ways that you
Yeah.
can say that. But regardless, what came out? Look at the trickle effect, right? As savvy shoppers and consumers, how many people do you think that potentially say maybe Wells Fargo is not the right bank for me?
Right.
And I'm picking
Totally.
on that because that's the idea that came to mind. But there's so many of
Yeah.
those, right?
But
And
yeah, that
so
do
before
business
you
like
know
that.
it,
Yeah.
consumers will choose an alternative because we always have options from which to choose. So, what is the best things for companies do? Not only to look at society and the different segments that comprises our communities and make sure that the organizations are a full representation of the same demographics that we're trying to serve, because you get better customer service, more understanding, you have an insight to different cultures, right? Because sometimes we don't
Right.
disclose. That could be for another day. There's so much to say about assimilation versus acculturation,
Right.
and we tend to push assimilation, but if we haven't quite given up our traditions and our beliefs and everything, they do interfere sometimes with the everyday business. And so part of being
Yes.
inclusive
Hmm.
is understanding those differences and embracing them, whether it is,
Yeah.
for people who are Muslims, time to pray in a room for that, or for mothers who just gave birth to have a nursing uh, room or something to give them
Hmm.
privacy. There's just so many things that we can go into, but if you think about, they always should understand the communities that they serve and strive to
Hmm.
understand the different cultures and needs and ideas and the hurt and their pain. Where do they feel
Yeah.
that they were not served or treated right? And then try
Yeah.
to compensate and work towards that by including those individuals in your culture and bring
Yeah.
about the transformation and education that has to happen, because a lot of that education can be organic. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
a structured D&I program.
Yeah.
It could be by having colleagues who eventually feel comfortable enough to share, this is who I am, this is what I have to
Yeah.
offer, this is how I feel different. But you have to create that trusting and safe environment for those healthy conversations to happen that eventually help transform the organization.
This is wonderful. Listen, Maria, we can go on and on, just exploring all of these nooks and
Yeah.
crannies, right, of DEI. But I want to really thank you again for making the time. I know we've been trying
Thank
to
you.
get you on for like 6, 7 weeks already, but we finally did it. Yay!
Yeah.
And yay! And I'm so thankful to have met you. Congratulations again on your recent award.
Did I
And
earn it now? Did I earn it
what was
now? Do
that?
you believe me? I have 26 years
Yes,
of
yes, I believe
experience.
you. I believe you. Lifetime. Yes, you've been doing this for a lifetime. Yes, and you still have much more to do. And I'm glad that we have met because I'm just tickle pink, very excited for what lays ahead of us. Okay, so thank you so much, and hopefully
Thank
we'll
you.
get to meet each other in person very soon.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that your viewers and people who follow you will reach out to us to learn more about Fane, inquire how they can make a difference, Maybe they want to join us as volunteers or companies who want to join us in different ways. And let's work together to make a difference. That's what we're all about. So thank you so much for the opportunity. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a
Bye.
good day.
You too.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.